It was a cold December night when this happened, and even now, thinking about it sends a shiver down my spine. I've been driving trucks for years, but there's one experience I'll never forget. Every time I drive those same roads, at the same time, the memories rush back, and I can feel the fear creeping in. That day changed me. Before it, I used to enjoy my job, taking breaks to relax, or even sip on some tea when I could. But after that night, I became a lot more careful. I work for a company that ships goods across the country, from Florida all the way up to Alaska, passing through places like Texas and California. One day, like any other, I showed up for my shift. My truck was ready, and my job was to take an empty container, pick up some goods, and then deliver them to California. But this time, it wasn't just any cargo. It was the personal belongings of families who were moving from Florida to Alaska and California. The container was big enough to hold things from different families, and I was supposed to pick up items from several places. First, I had to go to a house in a small, out-of-the-way village in Florida. The company manager, Hurry, had told me to pick up goods there before continuing on my route to Alaska. When I got to the house, something felt off. The owner was overseas, and the house had been locked up for an unknown amount of time. The owner had arranged everything with our company from abroad. I had some workers with me to help load the items, and once they finished, they left, as they were only supposed to help out in Florida. After that, it was just me and another driver who was supposed to accompany me on the long trip ahead. This house wasn't like any other I had seen. It was isolated, sitting near a jungle at the edge of the village. It looked like an old mansion, the kind you'd expect a wealthy family to own, but it seemed abandoned, almost forgotten. The air around it felt strange, and the sight of the house gave me a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The family's relatives were all living in Alaska, and the plan was to sell the house and send their belongings to them for safekeeping. When we arrived at the house, I called the operations center, where Hurry was in charge. He made a quick call, and not long after, a local man showed up holding a set of old vintage-style keys. I had a tough time getting my truck container positioned near the door, because the area was a bit tricky. I'm telling you all this so you can understand what happened next. As we started loading the belongings, I lit a cigarette, something I always do as a smoker, and stepped into the mansion. Right away, something felt very off about the place. The house was so dusty, it was like no one had bothered to clean it for years. The workers, or laborers as we called them, were covered in dirt just from moving things around. I stayed back and watched them load, really taking in the house. It was a grand mansion, but it was definitely old. There was just something strange about it, something that made the air feel heavy. Once the items from the ground floor were loaded, a few of the laborers headed upstairs. Suddenly, we heard a scream, a loud, panicked yell, the kind you'd expect from a grown man who had just seen something terrifying. I rushed upstairs to see what was going on. One of the men pointed at a chest that had a lock on it. He said, when I came up, this chest was moving. I couldn't believe it. I asked him, "Are you sure you're not imagining things?" He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I swear I'm not crazy." The chest was moving, and I could feel the locks shaking too. "Look for yourself." I looked at the chest, and sure enough, the locks were moving slightly. I didn't know what to make of it, so I just said, "Forget about it. We don't have time for this. Let's just finish loading." The man seemed a little shaken, but he had his job to do. He wasn't going to be traveling with us, just helping load the stuff and then heading back. The 12 laborers finished up their work, and I locked the container. After everything was packed up, I started the truck and we began our journey. The weather in Florida was typical warm and muggy, no sign of cold. We stopped for tea and food along the way, just taking a short break before heading on to the next part of the trip. Our truck was a new model, so it was running smoothly, and we were able to keep up a good speed. By now, we had crossed into Alaska and were driving through the night. The owner had sent us the exact location of where we needed to deliver the goods, and we followed it using Google Maps. That's when things started to get strange. We found ourselves driving into a thick forest. The road was surrounded by dense jungle, and there was no sign of anyone else. The only light came from our truck's headlights, and if you looked to either side, it was pure, pitch-black darkness. The cold was biting, just like you'd expect from an Alaskan winter. We kept the windows shut tight to keep the chill out. The truck was moving along fine, but the silence and the cold made everything feel so eerie. There were two of us driving, so we had split the shifts. We were used to this kind of trip, and sometimes one of us would drive the whole way while the other took a rest. The trucks were reliable, and they rarely had issues. If there was a problem, it was usually something simple, like a flat tire. As long as we checked the oil and water, the truck would keep running smoothly. This was a new, sturdy model, so we were pretty comfortable as we drove through the night. The cold air made smoking feel like a small pleasure, so we smoked the whole way. But as I was driving, something felt off. The atmosphere outside was strange, like there was something wrong, even though I couldn't figure out what it was. We were still following Google Maps, but there were a few moments when we thought we might have missed a turn. It didn't seem like we were on the right path anymore. We also made a big mistake. We didn't check the fuel gauge before we left. We were using a fuel card, so we could refuel whenever needed, but we hadn't realized that the fuel gauge was broken. The needle stayed in place, even though the fuel was running low. Eventually, the truck started jerking and then stopped completely, like it had run out of gas. We checked the odometer, did the math, and realized the truck had used up all the fuel, even though the gauge hadn't moved. It was a problem with the gauge, not the fuel itself. This was a brand new truck, so we didn't expect problems like this. But of course, with any machine, things can go wrong. Our hearts sank. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forest, with no one around for miles. It was pitch dark, and the cold was unbearable. The forest wasn't made up of tall trees, but thick, thorny bushes and scattered shrubs that stretched far into the distance on both sides of the road. The isolation of it all made the cold even worse, and it felt like the wilderness was closing in around us. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, a thick, dark wilderness that added to the creepy and unsettling atmosphere. My companion and I didn't speak a word to each other. We both felt the weight of the situation, and neither of us had the courage to break the silence. It was our fault. We had been careless about checking the fuel gauge, and now we were paying for it. We were experienced drivers, but in the middle of our casual conversation, we missed the fact that the truck had traveled farther than the fuel gauge indicated. The needle should have dropped, but it hadn't. Now, the truck was out of fuel, and we were stuck in the middle of nowhere. Normally, we carried a spare fuel can, but of course, it was empty this time. My companion suggested that one of us needed to go find fuel. Without much choice, we grabbed the empty can and opened the truck door. Cold hit us like a punch, freezing us to the bone. Neither of us wanted to step out into that freezing darkness, but my companion, being the braver of the two, insisted I stay behind to guard the truck. After all, it was loaded with valuable goods that belonged to the company. Before he left, we checked Google Maps. The nearest place was a small settlement about 6 kilometers away, but there was no sign of a fuel station. Still, we hoped someone there might have a way to get diesel. Once we figured out the direction, my companion started walking down the road in the direction we had been traveling. I watched as he disappeared into the dark night, leaving me alone in the freezing cold. I turned off the truck's lights and sat there in silence. The cold was unbearable, so I lit a cigarette, trying to warm my hands, and thought about starting a fire to keep warm. After a moment, I decided to gather some sticks and twigs from the forest floor and lit a fire near a rock. The warmth felt good, but the more I looked around, the more uneasy I became. It felt like someone could be hiding just out of sight, waiting to emerge from the bushes. As I sat there by the fire, I had a sudden thought the glow of the fire could be seen from a long way off. What if someone or something was watching it, waiting for me to reveal my position? The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind raced, and I started thinking about otherworldly creatures, maybe beings created by God, lurking in the dark forest. That's when I heard it. A strange noise came from the truck's container. At first, I didn't notice it because everything had been silent, but now, in the stillness of the night, I could clearly hear it. Something was moving inside. The truck's container doors were heavy metal, so it was strange to hear anything coming from inside. But I could definitely hear it now, something shifting, stirring. I considered putting out the fire, worried that someone or something might notice it and come toward me. But the cold was so intense that I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I stayed there, staring at the truck in the eerie forest, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The cold was so unbearable that I tried to convince myself it was just my fear playing tricks on me. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to calm down. But the strange noise persisted, subtle vibrations, barely noticeable but enough to get under my skin in the silence of the night. Curiosity started to eat away at me. It's human nature, we can't rest until we figure things out. Knowing I was stuck here for who knows how long, I decided to check out the source of the noise. At first, I thought it was a mechanical issue. Maybe something was still running or vibrating in the truck. I walked around it, checking every part, but everything looked fine. There were no issues with the truck's mechanics or electronics. But the sound, it was definitely coming from inside the container. Then it hit me. It could be a gadget or electronic toy accidentally left on, mixed in with the family's things. It's happened before. But this wasn't just an annoying noise. It felt off, almost sinister, especially with the eerie silence surrounding me. I was determined to stop it. I hoped the sound was coming from something near the front of the cargo, something I could easily get to. The truck's container had a special lock, an L key. I grabbed it from the truck's cabin, went around to the back, and started unscrewing it. After some effort, I managed to unlock one of the heavy metal doors and cracked it open just a little. Inside, everything looked as it had when it was loaded, nothing out of the ordinary. But as soon as I opened the door, the noise stopped. I was confused. Hadn't I just heard it seconds before? I left the door open and went back to the fire, hoping to stay warm, still on edge. But after a while, the noise started again. This time, it was louder, much louder, and it sounded like a living thing trapped inside, struggling to breathe. The noise was guttural and suffocating. It was coming from the back of the container. I got up again, this time focusing on a particular crate I had noticed earlier. It was the same crate a loader had pointed out when we were loading the truck, saying it had moved on its own, which had made him scream in fear. The noise was definitely coming from inside that crate. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a battery-operated device or something harmless. But the sound felt wrong, and I couldn't ignore it. I had to know what was inside. I grabbed a wrench from the truck, and with one hard strike, I broke the lock on the crate. When I finally opened it, what I saw inside froze me in terror. The sight before me was enough to freeze anyone in place. Inside that crate was a blood-stained shroud covered in strange markings. These weren't just random scribbles. They looked like the kind of symbols used in black magic, the kind you hear about in chilling stories. They were so unsettling that they sent a shiver through my entire body. As I unfolded the shroud, my heart stopped. Wrapped inside was a goat's head. The fear hit me like a wave, and without thinking, I slammed the crate shut again. It all clicked. This was the same crate we had picked up from that creepy mansion. It made sense now why there had been movement inside. Whoever had packed that crate had done it with one intention: to trap something. A ghost, a spirit, whatever it was. The markings were there to bind it, using dark magic I couldn't begin to understand. It was some form of dark sorcery, and it terrified me to my core. After that discovery, I locked the truck doors as fast as I could and went back to the fire, trying to warm myself and regain some composure. An hour passed, and I was still waiting for my partner to come back. I had no idea if he had found fuel or even if he was okay. My fear had escalated. I had heard stories about this kind of thing, but never experienced it firsthand. That's when things truly took a dark turn. I realized that by opening the crate, I might have accidentally released whatever entity had been trapped inside. As I sat by the fire, I heard a whoosh, like someone had rushed past me. I felt an eerie presence creeping closer, something circling around the truck. I kept hearing footsteps near the truck, but when I looked, there was no one there. The sound moved from one side of the truck to the other, as if something was walking around me. But whenever I checked, the space was empty. At one point, I swear I saw feet just standing there on the other side of the truck. I cautiously moved closer, my heart racing. But when I peeked around the corner, there was nothing. The eerie happenings kept happening, one after the other. I couldn't stop it. The terror had consumed me completely. I felt so overwhelmed, I started crying. Imagine that, a grown man, completely broken by fear. It was the kind of dread that words can't really describe. I stayed by the fire, shaking and reciting prayers with my voice trembling. Would you like me to keep going? As I continued reciting prayers, I could feel the atmosphere around me change. The movement in the bushes grew more intense, and I had the distinct feeling that whatever entity was out there was becoming angrier. It was as though my prayers were provoking it, and its presence was now more aggressive. I was terrified, but I kept going, staying close to the fire. I had heard that such entities avoid fire, so I kept my focus on the flames and recited louder, hoping the heat would protect me. Then, something unimaginable happened. An old, half-broken brick flew from the darkness and landed right in front of me. It was as though the entity was trying to stop me from praying. My fear quickly turned into pure terror when I realized it could physically harm me. Without thinking, I jumped up and ran back to the truck. I climbed in, shivering from both the cold and the fear that had taken over me. Inside the truck, I felt a slight sense of relief, though the dread still lingered. I continued reciting my prayers, trying to calm myself, waiting for my partner to return. After what felt like an eternity, I saw someone approaching in the distance. My heart raced as I turned on the headlights, half expecting to see something unnatural in the dark shapes of the trees. But it was my partner. I was relieved, but he could tell something was wrong with me. We didn't speak much at first, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He had managed to find enough fuel to get us to the nearest station. I refueled the truck, and we started driving. But as we went, my partner suddenly stopped me. He got out to check something and called me over. When I approached, he pointed out that the truck's back door was wide open. My stomach dropped. I had locked it tightly before, and there was the special L key lying on the ground next to it. When we looked inside, everything seemed fine at first. But then we saw it. The crate was still there, but the shroud and goat's head were gone. The items I had seen inside earlier were nowhere to be found. I couldn't understand it. Who had opened the door? And where had the items gone? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the truth was too chilling to accept. Something, or someone, had been inside the truck while we were away. We quickly resecured the crate, locking the truck properly this time. We didn't want to stay another minute in that place. I told my partner everything that had happened, but even as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us, watching us. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, unsettling feeling that wouldn't go away. We finally made it to a more populated area and stopped at a petrol station to refuel again. We finished our delivery, but I'll never forget that night. It remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and every time I think about it, a chill runs down my spine. Thank you for listening to my story. Now, let's hear from another truck driver who has a chilling encounter of his own. I am working in Arizona. I've experienced some strange and unusual incidents, one of which I'd like to share with you today. Generally, I always try to travel during the day, but sometimes my job requires me to drive at night. Many of the roads I take are so desolate that you don't see another vehicle for miles. As you may know, Arizona is full of deserts and mountains, and these areas become eerily quiet and frighteningly desolate at night. One day, I was on a night drive because my boss suddenly messaged me saying I had to make an urgent delivery, and there wasn't much time. I quickly got ready, loaded the cargo, and hit the highway. The road was completely deserted. There wasn't a soul in sight. As I drove through the darkness, I scanned my surroundings, and everything was pitch black. Suddenly, I noticed something strange on the road ahead. It looked like someone had placed a pile of something right in my path. I reluctantly hit the brakes and stepped out of the truck to investigate. But when I got out, there was nothing there. I thought it was just my imagination and got back into the truck to continue my journey. Barely a few minutes passed when I started hearing whispers, as if someone was speaking near me. I ignored it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The music I had playing in the truck also helped me ignore the sound. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder and sounded like they were in a language I couldn't understand. A strange feeling overcame me, and I turned off the music to focus. I looked around, convinced that I wasn't alone. When I glanced at the rearview mirror, I froze. I saw a figure sitting in the back seat. My hands went cold, and my heart started racing. I was so terrified I couldn't even turn around to confirm what I'd seen. I immediately started reciting prayers and other verses in my heart. Gathering my courage, I glanced back, but no one was there. Relieved, I kept driving as I had no choice. I couldn't take a shortcut or change the route, and crossing the desert at night was out of the question. So I trusted in God and pressed on. A little while later, I heard a knock on the truck door. My heart started pounding. I didn't open it because I knew it was impossible for anyone to knock on a moving truck. Then, I felt a sudden cold breeze sweep through the truck, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the side mirror. It was a woman, but her face was twisted and horrifying. She was chasing the truck on all fours, like an animal. The sight chilled me to the core. I felt like my soul was about to leave my body. I sped up the truck, but she kept pace with me, running at an unnatural speed. Sweat poured down my face as I began loudly reciting verses, praying to get off that highway as quickly as possible. But suddenly, the woman leapt onto the side of the truck and clung to the door, trying to open it and get inside. I was struggling to control myself as I kept the truck door firmly shut with all my strength. My hands were trembling, and I was breathing heavily. The woman kept pounding on the door so hard that it began shaking. I continuously recited prayers, and after a few moments, the woman disappeared, leaving the surroundings eerily silent once again. Even though the silence returned, I couldn't steady my nerves. My voice trembled, and my body shook with fear. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. After some time, when I calmed down a little, I sped up the truck, hoping to get away from that place as quickly as possible. However, I still had a long journey ahead. Midnight had passed, and it was around 1 a.m. when I saw the same woman standing on the roadside again. As I approached her, she slowly moved to stand in the middle of the road. Her face was just as horrifying as before. I mustered all my courage and drove the truck forward at high speed, passing her. But as I checked my side mirror, I saw her again. I couldn't believe my eyes. I increased the truck's speed, but the faster I tried to go, the slower the truck seemed to move. Then, she started coming closer to the truck. Her long hair was flowing in the wind, and her eyes were completely white. I felt an unbearable weight pressing on my chest as fear overwhelmed me. Suddenly, she started knocking on the truck door again, trying to open it. I kept the door tightly shut with all my strength, while reciting prayers. This time, she seemed angrier, pulling on the door so violently that I feared it might break. My entire body was drenched in sweat, and I could hear loud, terrifying screams. The screams were so intense and chilling that they echoed in my ears and seemed to pierce through my mind. It felt like they would drive me insane. I covered my ears, but the screams didn't stop. It was as if something had taken control of me. In desperation, I parked the truck on the side of the road and started reciting prayers. As I recited, the woman's screams gradually subsided and silence returned. When I looked in the side mirror, she was gone. I thanked God for His mercy. The terror of her screams still lingered in the air, and the atmosphere was heavy with fear. If you had been there, you would understand how horrifying it was. I restarted the truck and continued my journey. But as I drove, strange thoughts kept creeping into my mind. A little later, I saw a truck parked by the roadside, engulfed in flames. Initially, I thought about just driving past it, but then I decided to stop, thinking someone might need my help. I parked a little ahead, got out of my truck, and cautiously approached the burning vehicle. When I looked inside the truck, I saw a horrifying scene. There was a man inside with a severely burned and disfigured face. He was crying. Suddenly, he turned to look at me and started smiling. As I watched, his face became even more grotesque and terrifying. A chill ran through my body. The man then spoke in a deep, menacing voice. "This road belongs to us. No one leaves here alive." My heart sank, and I ran back to my truck. But as I climbed in, he said, "This is your final journey. You will not return from this road." I began reciting the prayers, but the man's gaze was so piercing that it felt as though it could strip away my faith. It seemed like a nightmare, but it wasn't. It was a horrifying reality. he shouted in a booming voice. "This highway has been cursed for centuries. Anyone who travels here at night never returns alive." I tried to return to my truck, but as I turned around, both the man and the burning truck had disappeared. I couldn't believe my eyes, and my fear deepened. I quickly started my truck, reciting prayers as I drove forward, but his words echoed in my mind. "This is your last journey." What did he mean by that? Was I going to die? I couldn't understand what was happening to me. The sound of the truck's engine seemed to echo in the eerie silence around me. The darkness on the road was suffocating, and the surrounding mountains felt even more ominous. All I wanted was for this terrifying ordeal to end so I could reach my destination safely. As the night dragged on, my anxiety kept growing. Then, I saw the same woman standing by the roadside again. This time, she was standing right in the middle of the road, staring directly at me. Her eyes were now even more terrifying and hollow. I couldn't understand why she was after me. I gathered my courage, silently reciting prayers, and drove the truck toward her. As I approached, she suddenly vanished into thin air. I accelerated, hoping I'd finally left her behind, but after some moments, I saw her again in the side mirror. She seemed to be chasing me. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished from sight. I turned my head to check, but she was nowhere to be seen. I thought I was finally free, but then I heard a faint sound inside the truck. I turned around, and my heart nearly stopped. She was sitting on the back seat with a strange smile on her face. Her presence filled the truck with an overwhelming sense of dread. I almost lost control of the vehicle and narrowly avoided an accident. I tried to focus on the road, but she leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Do you really think I can't enter?" Her voice sent chills down my spine. I can't put into words how terrifying it was. It felt like this was the end, and I would not survive. With all my strength, I closed my eyes and prayed to God for help. Suddenly, something appeared in the truck's headlights, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I couldn't think straight. All I could do was slam the brakes and bring the truck to a stop. I stepped out of the truck, trembling. When I looked back, the woman had vanished. I let out a sigh of relief and sat on a nearby bench to catch my breath. But even then, I could feel a strange, cold sensation in the air. As I calmed down slightly, I noticed a counter nearby, where an elderly woman was staring at me. Her gaze was unsettling. She looked strange and out of place, but I decided to ignore it. Suddenly, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I dismissed her words and asked for a glass of water. She handed it to me, but then added ominously, "Nothing here is what it seems." She smiled at me in a strange way, her smile unsettlingly odd. She said, "There's a place to sleep inside. If you want, you can spend the night here." Given that morning was only a few hours away, I thought it might be the best option. I didn't take her words seriously and tried to sleep, but as soon as I lay down, I felt as though someone else was there with me. I quickly turned on my phone's flashlight, but there was no one around. My heart was still pounding with fear. I turned off the light and closed my eyes, trying to calm myself. Sleep, however, was impossible. Fear had overtaken my entire being. A little while later, I started hearing faint whispers again. I was sure the woman was back. Terrified, I shut my eyes tightly and recited every prayer I could remember. My body was trembling, but I mustered all my courage and kept praying to God for help. I was on the verge of tears when suddenly I heard laughter. It sounded like someone was mocking my helplessness. Then I felt something like footsteps approaching me. The sound was getting closer and closer, and I felt someone's breath on the back of my neck. My body froze. I couldn't move at all. The prayers I had been reciting slipped from my memory. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I thought my life was about to end. With all my strength, I shouted and forced myself to stand. Without looking back, I ran outside as fast as I could. What I saw when I got outside is something I will never forget. Blood and raw flesh were scattered everywhere. The smell was so putrid that it was unbearable, even for a second. The entire tea stall had transformed. It no longer looked like the same place. Forget my truck. I just ran toward the road. As I looked back, I saw many figures crawling on their hands and feet, chasing me. I ran and ran until I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I found myself in a hospital. After that night, I was unwell for several months. Fear lingered in my heart all the time. Eventually, I sought spiritual help, and it took 3 months of treatment before I finally recovered. Thank God, I am now completely fine. So, listeners, these are today's stories. If you liked it, please make sure to share it. Friends, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, don't forget to like the video. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon to turn on notifications so you can join my horror stories family. Take care of yourself until we meet again with another interesting story.